Kenna Blackwood's fingers traced the worn fabric of her oversized grey hoodie as she stood before the imposing brick facade of Roosevelt High School. The morning air in Denver carried a crisp bite that reminded her painfully of the mountain mornings back home in Whitefish, Montana, where the peaks rose like ancient guardians around her family's small ranch. Here, the Rocky Mountains felt distant and unfriendly, mere shadows on the horizon of a sprawling suburban landscape that seemed determined to swallow her whole. The hoodie had been her grandfather's, passed down through her father and finally to her when she turned 13. The soft cotton blend had faded from its original charcoal to something resembling storm clouds, and the cuffs were frayed from countless nervous fidgeting sessions. But it remained her most treasured possession, a tangible connection to the life she'd been forced to leave behind when her father's job transferred the family to this concrete jungle of strip malls and subdivisions. At 17, Kenna stood barely 5'4", with a frame that appeared almost fragile beneath the voluminous sweatshirt. Her dark auburn hair hung in natural waves that she deliberately kept long enough to create a curtain around her face. And her emerald green eyes, her grandmother's eyes, as her father often reminded her, stayed perpetually focused on the scuffed sneakers that had seen better days. The shoes were practical rather than fashionable, built for the hiking trails that crisscrossed the wilderness around her old home, not for navigating the polished hallways of Colorado's third-largest high school. 3 months and 4 days had passed since the moving truck had pulled away from their ranch, leaving behind the only life Kenna had ever known. Her father, Dr. Michael Blackwood, had accepted a position as head veterinarian at Denver's largest animal hospital, a career opportunity he couldn't refuse despite the family upheaval it would cause. Her mother, Sarah, had put on a brave face about the move, finding work as a freelance graphic designer and throwing herself into the task of making their new suburban house feel like home. But Kenna could see the sadness in her parents' eyes when they thought she wasn't looking, the same grief for their lost mountain sanctuary that ate at her own heart every morning when she woke to the sound of traffic instead of wind through pine trees. Roosevelt High School sprawled across nearly 40 acres, housing over 3,000 students in a maze of interconnected buildings that still confused Kenna despite her months of attendance. The architecture was aggressively modern, all clean lines and energy-efficient windows that reflected the Colorado sun like mirrors. Inside, the hallways stretched endlessly, lined with burgundy lockers and motivational posters that proclaimed the virtues of school spirit and academic excellence. The fluorescent lighting cast everything in a harsh, artificial glow that made Kenna's pale skin look almost translucent, and emphasized the dark circles under her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. In Whitefish, she had attended a small high school where everyone knew everyone, where her quietness had been accepted as simply part of who she was. She'd had friends there, not many, but genuine ones who understood her love of solitude and respected her preference for listening rather than speaking. Here, in this vast institutional maze, her silence seemed to mark her as different in a way that invited unwanted attention from all the wrong people. The morning routine had become a carefully choreographed dance of avoidance. Kenna would arrive at school precisely 15 minutes before the first bell, giving her enough time to reach her locker without encountering the worst of the morning social chaos, but not so early that she had to endure extended periods of standing alone while other students clustered in their established groups. She kept her head down, her movements efficient and purposeful, trying to project an aura of someone who knew exactly where they were going, even when she felt completely lost. Her first period was advanced placement chemistry with Mrs. Patterson, a stern woman in her 50s whose classroom smelled perpetually of sulfur and industrial-strength cleaning supplies. Kenna had always excelled in the sciences, finding comfort in the predictable nature of chemical reactions and mathematical formulas. Here, at least, her knowledge spoke louder than her social awkwardness, and Mrs. Patterson seemed to appreciate students who preferred letting their work demonstrate their understanding rather than participating in class discussions. The classroom itself was a study in organized chaos, with black-topped lab benches arranged in neat rows and equipment cabinets lining the walls like metallic guardians of knowledge. Periodic table posters and safety reminders covered every available surface, and the ever-present smell of Bunsen burners lingered even when none were lit. Kenna had claimed a seat in the third row, far enough back to avoid being called upon constantly, but close enough to hear every word of Mrs. Patterson's lectures. It was in the hallway outside this classroom sanctuary that her tormentors first cornered her, on a Tuesday morning that had started with the false promise of normalcy. Kenna had been reviewing her notes for the upcoming quiz when she sensed rather than saw the approach of trouble. The conversations around her seemed to quiet, and she felt the weight of multiple gazes settling on her like a physical presence. Tyler Garrison emerged from the crowd of students like a golden god stepping down from Mount Olympus. At 18, he stood 6'2", with the kind of broad-shouldered, narrow-waisted build that spoke of countless hours in the weight room. His blonde hair was styled with the casual perfection that only came from expensive barber visits and premium hair products, and his blue eyes held the cold confidence of someone who had never known defeat. The Letterman jacket draped across his shoulders was a testament to his status as Roosevelt's star quarterback, the golden boy who had led the team to 3 consecutive state championship appearances. Tyler's presence seemed to bend the very air around him, creating an invisible force field that other students instinctively respected. He moved through the hallways like royalty, accepting the deference of his subjects as his natural due. Teachers spoke to him with the kind of gentle deference usually reserved for valuable donors, and his peers competed for even the smallest acknowledgement from their social superior. Brady Summers flanked Tyler's left side like a loyal lieutenant, his red hair cropped in a military-precise cut that emphasized the sharp angles of his face. Standing several inches shorter than Tyler, but making up for it with an almost manic intensity, Brady had the look of someone who enjoyed conflict for its own sake. His freckled skin was perpetually flushed, as if he were always on the verge of anger, and his pale blue eyes held a coldness that seemed to search constantly for weakness to exploit. Where Tyler's cruelty was calculated and strategic, Brady's was impulsive and vicious. He was the kind of person who pulled wings off flies as a child and graduated to psychological torture as he matured. His family owned one of Denver's largest construction companies, which afforded him a certain status despite his secondary role in the school's social hierarchy. He used his proximity to Tyler to amplify his own importance while serving as the quarterback's primary enforcer. Ashley Morrison completed the terrible trinity, her presence adding a feminine dimension to their casual cruelty. She stood 5'6" in her designer heels, with the kind of perfectly maintained beauty that required significant financial investment. Her honey blonde hair cascaded past her shoulders in waves that never seemed to move despite Colorado's notorious wind, and her makeup was applied with the precision of a master artist. Her clothing was exclusively designer, carefully chosen to project an image of effortless sophistication while making it clear that she could afford things her classmates could only dream of. Ashley's family owned a successful chain of luxury car dealerships throughout the Denver metropolitan area, and she had grown up surrounded by the kind of casual wealth that treated expensive things as disposable. Her cruelty was perhaps the most insidious of the three because it was wrapped in the appearance of feminine grace. She could destroy someone's self-esteem with a perfectly timed compliment that was actually an insult, could orchestrate social exile with the same skill that other people used to plan dinner parties. "Watch where you're going, freak." Tyler's voice cut through the morning chatter like a blade dragged across metal. The words were delivered with the casual indifference of someone commenting on the weather, but they carried the weight of absolute authority. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as other students turned to witness the unfolding drama, their faces showing the mixture of fascination and relief that came from watching someone else become the target. Kenna had been lost in thought, mentally reviewing the molecular structures she would need to identify on the chemistry quiz, when Tyler's broad form materialized directly in her path. She looked up, startled, to find herself facing the three people she had worked hardest to avoid since her arrival at Roosevelt. Her heart immediately began hammering against her ribs, and her mouth went dry with the taste of copper and fear. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hallway noise. The apology was automatic, ingrained by months of similar encounters where submission was the path of least resistance. She tried to step around Tyler's imposing form, but Brady moved smoothly to block her escape route, his pale eyes glittering with anticipation. "Sorry doesn't cut it when you're contaminating our school with your presence," Ashley said, her voice carrying the precise diction of expensive private school education. She studied Kenna the way a scientist might examine an interesting specimen, her perfectly manicured fingers playing with the strap of her Prada bag. "Seriously, does anyone else smell something unpleasant? It's like someone opened a thrift store in here." The comment sparked laughter from the growing crowd of students who had stopped to watch the daily ritual. Kenna felt heat flood her cheeks as the humiliation settled over her like a heavy blanket. She clutched her backpack straps tighter, her knuckles turning white beneath the oversized sleeves of her beloved hoodie. The fabric that had once provided comfort now felt like a target, marking her as different in a way that invited this kind of attention. The laughter cut through her like physical wounds, each chuckle and snicker adding to the weight of her isolation. She recognized some of the faces in the crowd, classmates from various periods, students she passed in the hallways every day without acknowledgement. Their expressions ranged from cruel amusement to uncomfortable fascination, but not one showed anything resembling sympathy or solidarity. She was alone in this circle of mockery, as isolated as if she were standing in the middle of an empty field. "Maybe if you actually tried to interact with people instead of creeping around like some kind of serial killer, you'd have friends," Tyler continued, his voice pitched perfectly to carry to the maximum number of listeners. "But I guess that would require having an actual personality instead of whatever this is." He gestured dismissively at her entire existence, the motion conveying more contempt than words ever could. Kenna forced herself to take a deep breath, drawing on techniques her father had taught her during their long conversations about handling difficult situations. Dr. Blackwood had always emphasized the importance of remaining calm under pressure, of not allowing others to dictate your emotional state. But his advice had been given in the context of their quiet ranch in Montana, where conflicts were resolved through honest conversation rather than public humiliation. "I need to get to class," she said, her voice gaining a fraction of strength. She tried once more to step around the human barrier they had formed, but Brady's hand shot out to press against her shoulder, stopping her forward momentum. "Where do you think you're going?" Brady's voice dropped to a threatening whisper, though it was still loud enough for the crowd to hear every word. "We're not done talking to you, freak." The word hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. She had heard it whispered in hallways, seen it scrawled on bathroom walls, felt it in the stares that followed her wherever she went. The name had become her unofficial identity at Roosevelt High School, reducing her complex humanity to something small and manageable that others could mock and dismiss. Kenna's training kicked in automatically, her body recognizing the threat even as her mind struggled to process the social dynamics at play. 6 years of mixed martial arts instruction under Sensei Williams back in Whitefish had taught her to read body language, to recognize when a situation was escalating toward violence. Brady's stance was aggressive, his weight forward on the balls of his feet, his hands positioned to grab or strike. Tyler was flanking her, using his size to intimidate, while Ashley blocked her psychological retreat with her cutting words. She could end this confrontation in seconds. A simple wrist grab and twist would send Brady to his knees. A strategic knee strike would double Tyler over and give her room to escape. Ashley posed no physical threat at all, but her father's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her that violence should always be the last resort, that true strength came from finding peaceful solutions to difficult problems. Dr. Michael Blackwood had been the one to first suggest martial arts training when Kenna was 11 years old. She had been struggling with self-confidence issues, and he thought the physical discipline and mental focus required by martial arts might help her find her inner strength. What he hadn't anticipated was how naturally gifted she would prove to be at the combative arts. Sensei Williams ran a small dojo in downtown Whitefish, teaching a hybrid system that combined elements of karate, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and Muay Thai kickboxing. He was a former Marine who had found peace through the disciplined practice of martial arts, and he approached teaching with the same methodical precision he had once applied to military operations. From their very first class, he recognized something special in Kenna's natural timing and spatial awareness. Martial arts isn't about fighting, Sensei Williams had told her during one of their early training sessions. It's about understanding yourself and your relationship to the world around you. The physical techniques are just tools. What matters is the discipline of mind and spirit that makes you strong enough not to use them. Under his guidance, Kenna had discovered that her quiet nature and intense focus made her an ideal martial arts student. She absorbed techniques like a sponge, practicing forms and combinations with the same methodical precision she applied to her academic studies. Her small stature was actually an advantage in many ways, allowing her to develop speed and agility that larger opponents couldn't match. By the time she was 15, Kenna had earned her black belt and was competing in regional tournaments throughout Montana and Wyoming. Her specialty was point sparring, a form of competition that emphasized precise technique and controlled contact over raw aggression. She had developed a fighting style that relied on perfect timing and technical superiority rather than brute force, making her particularly dangerous against larger, stronger opponents who underestimated her capabilities. But more important than the physical skills was the mental discipline that martial arts had instilled in her. Sensei Williams had taught her to remain calm under pressure, to assess threats objectively rather than emotionally, and to use the minimum force necessary to resolve any conflict. Violence wasn't the goal. It was the last resort when all other options had been exhausted. Standing in the hallway at Roosevelt High School, surrounded by students who viewed her as entertainment rather than a human being, Kenna felt the familiar assessment process begin automatically. Brady was untrained, relying on size and aggression rather than skill. Tyler was probably stronger, but showed no signs of formal combat training. Ashley wasn't a physical threat at all. If this situation escalated to violence, she could end it quickly and efficiently. But her father's teachings held her back. Dr. Blackwood had always emphasized that true strength came from helping others rather than hurting them, that the mark of a genuinely powerful person was their ability to show mercy even when they had the upper hand. He had raised her to believe that every person deserved dignity and respect, even those who seemed incapable of showing the same courtesy to others. "I just want to get to class," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying more authority than if she had shouted. For just a moment, something flickered in her green eyes, a glimpse of the trained fighter beneath the quiet exterior. But it passed so quickly that anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it would have missed it entirely. Tyler laughed, the sound sharp and mocking as it echoed off the hallway walls. "She just wants to get to class, guys. The little mouse is worried about being late." The nickname sent a chill down Kenna's spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning system. Mouse. Small, insignificant, helpless. Something to be toyed with rather than taken seriously. She had heard worse insults in her life, but somehow this diminutive struck at something fundamental in her sense of self. "Maybe we should help her find her way," Ashley suggested with false sweetness, her voice dripping with the kind of synthetic concern that was more insulting than open hostility. "After all, we wouldn't want our little mouse to get lost in the big, scary hallways." Tyler reached out as if to pat Kenna's head in a gesture of condescending affection, but she flinched away so violently that she stumbled backward into the wall. The impact sent her books tumbling to the floor, pages scattering like autumn leaves across the polished linoleum. Her chemistry notebook fell open, revealing weeks of careful notes and detailed diagrams written in her precise handwriting. The sight of her scattered belongings triggered something primal in Kenna's chest, a surge of protective fury that had nothing to do with martial arts training and everything to do with basic human dignity. Those notes represented hours of careful study, preparation for a future that seemed increasingly uncertain with each passing day at Roosevelt High School. They were proof of her intelligence, her dedication, her refusal to let circumstances defeat her. Tyler kicked at the papers with his expensive athletic shoes, sending them sliding across the dirty floor like discarded trash. "Oops," he said with exaggerated innocence, his blue eyes sparkling with malicious amusement. "Looks like someone's clumsy." Brady joined in, stepping on several sheets of homework as he moved to block Kenna's access to her scattered materials. "What a shame," he said, his voice thick with mock sympathy. "All that hard work ruined." As Kenna knelt to gather her scattered belongings, she became aware of someone pushing through the crowd of spectators. The students parted reluctantly, their disappointment at the interruption clear on their faces. Liam Rodriguez appeared at the edge of the circle like a knight emerging from morning mist, his dark eyes taking in the scene with obvious concern and growing anger. Liam stood slightly below average height at 5 feet 8 inches, but he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had never needed to prove his worth through cruelty. His black hair was perpetually tousled from the Colorado wind, and his olive-complected face bore the kind of natural warmth that drew people like moths to a flame. He wore simple clothes, jeans, sneakers, and a flannel shirt that had seen better days, but somehow managed to look more put together than students who spent hundreds of dollars on their wardrobes. Unlike Tyler, who commanded attention through force of personality and social status, Liam earned respect through his character. He was the student who helped teachers carry supplies to their cars, who tutored struggling classmates without being asked, who could be counted on to do the right thing even when no one was watching. His family had immigrated from Guadalajara when he was 7 years old, and he had grown up translating documents and navigating bureaucracy for relatives who were still learning English. "Hey, Tyler," Liam said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from genuine moral conviction rather than social positioning. "Maybe give her some space?" Tyler's expression shifted, his easy confidence flickering for just a moment as he recognized the implicit challenge. Liam wasn't part of the popular crowd, didn't run in the same social circles or attend the same exclusive parties, but he commanded a different kind of respect, the kind that came from being known as someone who stood up for what was right regardless of the personal cost. "Mind your own business, Rodriguez," Ashley snapped, stepping forward to support her boyfriend with the automatic loyalty of someone whose identity was entirely tied to their relationship status. "Nobody asked for your opinion." The dismissal was calculated to sting, playing on both Liam's ethnicity and his outsider status in the school's social hierarchy. Ashley's family had contributed generously to various school programs over the years, giving her a sense of ownership over the institution that she wielded like a weapon against anyone she deemed inferior. Liam ignored her completely, instead crouching down to help Kenna collect her scattered papers. His movements were gentle, respectful, treating her belongings with the same care he would have shown his own. Their fingers brushed as he handed her the chemistry notebook, and Kenna felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with the simple kindness of human contact. "Thank you," she whispered, meeting his eyes for just a moment before looking away. Up close, she could see the concern etched in the lines around his dark brown eyes, the genuine care that radiated from him like warmth from a campfire. "Don't mention it," he replied softly, then stood to face Tyler again. The two young men were roughly the same age, but they couldn't have been more different in their approach to the world. Where Tyler used his advantages to elevate himself above others, Liam used his strengths to lift others up. "Come on, man, you're better than this." The words were delivered without accusation or judgment, but they hit Tyler like a physical blow. For just a moment, his carefully constructed facade cracked, revealing something that might have been shame or self-awareness. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the defensive anger of someone who didn't like being reminded of their capacity for decency. "Better than what?" Tyler demanded, his voice rising slightly. "Better than pointing out that some people don't belong here?" Before Liam could respond, the arrival of Mr. Peterson, the chemistry teacher, brought the confrontation to an abrupt halt. The older man's presence scattered the crowd of spectators like leaves before a strong wind, students suddenly remembering they had places to be and things to do that didn't involve witnessing someone else's humiliation. "Is there a problem here?" Mr. Peterson asked, his eyes moving between the scattered papers on the floor and the obvious tension in the air. He was a soft-spoken man in his early 60s with graying hair and the kind of patient demeanor that came from decades of dealing with teenage drama. "No problem, sir," Tyler said smoothly, his public persona sliding back into place like a well-worn mask. "Just helping a fellow student pick up her things." Mr. Peterson's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by this explanation, but years of experience had taught him to choose his battles carefully. Instead of pursuing the obvious inconsistencies in Tyler's story, he simply nodded and continued toward his classroom, though his pace suggested he would be keeping an ear out for any further disturbances. The crowd dispersed reluctantly, their entertainment cut short by adult supervision. Within moments, the hallway had returned to its normal level of chaos, leaving Kenna alone with Liam in the aftermath of her latest humiliation. "Are you okay?" Liam asked, genuine concern evident in his voice. He made no move to rush away or distance himself from her, despite the social risk that association with the school's designated outcast might pose to his own reputation. Kenna nodded quickly, clutching her recovered books to her chest like armor. "I'm fine. Thank you for helping me." "Those guys are jerks," Liam said, shaking his head in disgust. "You don't deserve that treatment." Something twisted in Kenna's chest at his kindness, a mixture of gratitude and guilt that made her feel simultaneously better and worse. She wanted to tell him that she wasn't as helpless as she appeared, that beneath her quiet exterior lay 6 years of rigorous martial arts training that could have ended the confrontation in seconds. She wanted to explain that her passivity was a choice rather than weakness, that she had deliberately chosen mercy over violence despite having every provocation to fight back. But the words stuck in her throat, trapped by years of her father's teaching about the importance of humility and restraint. Dr. Blackwood had always emphasized that true martial artists didn't seek conflict or boast about their abilities. The strongest people were often the quietest, he had told her, because they had nothing to prove to anyone. "I should get to class," she said instead, her voice barely above a whisper. Liam nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "If you ever need someone to talk to, you know where to find me." The offer was genuine, without any expectation of reciprocation or hidden agenda. Kenna could see the sincerity in his dark eyes, the kind of natural empathy that seemed increasingly rare in her new world. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to have a real friend again, someone who saw her as a person rather than a target. "Thank you," she said again, then hurried toward her chemistry class before she could do something foolish, like start crying in the middle of the hallway. The morning passed in a blur of sideways glances and whispered comments that followed her from class to class like shadows. In English literature, she discovered that someone had written F-R-E-A-K on her desk in permanent marker, the letters bold and black against the pale laminate surface. Mrs. Chen, the English teacher, noticed the graffiti but said nothing, simply moving Kenna to a different seat without drawing attention to the vandalism. During her third period calculus class, she found a note tucked inside her textbook, a crude drawing of a mouse wearing her distinctive hoodie, surrounded by insulting comments about her appearance and social status. The artwork was actually quite skilled, which somehow made it more hurtful than if it had been a crude scrawl. Someone had taken time and effort to create this targeted cruelty, treating her pain as entertainment worthy of artistic expression. Lunch period presented its own unique challenges. The cafeteria at Roosevelt High School was a sprawling space designed to accommodate nearly 1,000 students during each of the 3 lunch periods. Round tables for 8 were arranged throughout the room, with additional rectangular tables along the walls for larger groups. The noise level was overwhelming, hundreds of conversations mixing with the clatter of trays and the background music that played from speakers mounted near the ceiling. Kenna collected her lunch, a sandwich from home, an apple, and a bottle of water, and made her way to her usual table in the far corner of the cafeteria. The location was strategically chosen for its distance from the popular tables and its proximity to an emergency exit, though she had never needed to actually flee the building. From her isolated position, she could observe the complex social dynamics that played out during lunch period while remaining largely invisible herself. The popular students commanded the center of the room like royalty holding court. Tyler's table was always surrounded by supplicants hoping for acknowledgement, lesser athletes and wannabe socialites who competed for the privilege of basking in reflected glory. Ashley presided over her own cluster of followers, girls who copied her fashion choices and laughed at her jokes with the desperate enthusiasm of people who understood that their social survival depended on royal favor. At her lonely outpost, Kenna picked at her sandwich while pretending to read her chemistry textbook. The food tasted like cardboard, her appetite diminished by the morning's humiliation and the constant weight of isolation. She tried to focus on the molecular diagrams in her textbook, but her attention kept drifting to the tables of laughing students who seemed to navigate social interactions with the same ease she felt when practicing martial arts forms. "Mind if I sit here?" The voice startled her from her contemplation, and she looked up to find Liam standing beside her table with his lunch tray. He was smiling, but she could see the awareness in his eyes. He knew exactly what it meant to be seen associating with the school's designated outcast. "You don't have to," she said quickly, not wanting to become the reason for his own social difficulties. "I know it's not exactly the best spot for your reputation." Liam slid into the seat across from her without hesitation. "My reputation can handle it," he said simply. Besides, I prefer interesting conversation over social posturing. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, Liam's presence somehow making the awful cafeteria food taste slightly better. Kenna found herself stealing glances at him, trying to understand what motivated his kindness. In her experience, people were nice to her either because they wanted something or because they felt sorry for her. But Liam seemed genuinely content to share lunch with someone who could offer nothing in return except honest conversation. "So what's Montana like?" he asked eventually, unwrapping a sandwich that looked suspiciously homemade compared to the cafeteria offerings surrounding them. "Beautiful," Kenna replied automatically, then found herself expanding on the simple response. "The mountains are everywhere. You can see them from almost any point in town, and the sky is so big you feel like you could fall right into it." "Sounds amazing. Do you miss it?" "Every day," she admitted, surprised by her own honesty. "Everything here is so big, so many people, so much noise. Back home you could walk for miles and never see another person if you wanted to." Liam nodded thoughtfully. "My family came from Guadalajara when I was 7. I used to dream about going back, especially during the first few years when everything here felt foreign and overwhelming." "Do you still want to go back?" "Sometimes," he said with a shrug. "But this is home now, you know. My little sisters were born here, my parents have built a life here. You can miss a place without wanting to abandon the good things you found somewhere new." His words carried a wisdom that seemed beyond his 18 years, and Kenna found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't since arriving in Colorado. For the first time in months, she was having a real conversation with someone who saw her as a person, rather than a curiosity or a target. Their lunch companionship became a daily routine over the following weeks. Liam would appear at her table each day with his homemade sandwich and easy smile, treating their association as perfectly natural, despite the stares and whispers it generated from other students. He told her stories about his family's restaurant, where he worked part-time as a server and translator for Spanish-speaking customers. She shared carefully edited memories of Montana, describing the outdoor adventures and small-town community she had left behind. Through these conversations, Kenna began to understand that Liam's kindness wasn't motivated by pity or some misguided savior complex. He was genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions, treating her intelligence and insights with the respect she had been denied since arriving at Roosevelt. When she mentioned her interest in chemistry, he listened with the same attention he might have given to a teacher's lecture. When she shared her love of hiking and outdoor activities, he responded with stories of camping trips with his extended family in the Colorado mountains. The friendship that developed between them was genuine and reciprocal, based on mutual respect rather than social convenience. For the first time since arriving in Denver, Kenna began to feel like something approaching a normal teenager. She still wore her grandfather's hoodie every day, still kept her head down in the hallways, but the crushing weight of isolation had lifted slightly. Unfortunately, her newfound happiness did not go unnoticed by those who had appointed themselves as guardians of the school's social order. Tyler's campaign against Kenna intensified as her friendship with Liam became more apparent. The quarterback seemed to take personal offense at the idea that his designated target might find any measure of happiness or acceptance. His attacks became more calculated, more cruel, as if he were determined to remind her of her place in the hierarchy he had established. The incident started small. Books knocked from her hands as she walked between classes, drinks accidentally spilled near her locker, whispered comments that followed her through the hallways like malicious ghosts. Tyler was careful to maintain plausible deniability, ensuring that any adult witnesses would see only a series of unfortunate accidents rather than a sustained campaign of harassment. Brady's contributions were less subtle, but equally effective. He specialized in intimidation tactics that stopped just short of physical assault, stepping into her path and forcing her to walk around him, standing too close during group activities, making comments about what might happen to students who didn't know their place. His pale blue eyes held a constant threat, a promise of escalation that kept Kenna constantly on edge. Ashley's role was perhaps the most insidious because it operated on a level that adults rarely recognized or addressed. She orchestrated social isolation with the precision of a military strategist, ensuring that Kenna remained excluded from group activities, study sessions, and informal gatherings. Her weapons were whispered rumors and strategic gossip, casual comments that poisoned the social atmosphere around Kenna without ever rising to the level of obvious bullying. The trio's efforts were having their intended effect. Despite Liam's friendship, Kenna found herself becoming increasingly isolated from her classmates. Students who might have been neutral or even friendly began avoiding her, unwilling to risk their own social standing by association with someone who had been marked for exclusion. Teachers, who had initially shown interest in her academic abilities, began treating her with the kind of careful distance usually reserved for problem students. But it was the threat to Liam that finally pushed Kenna toward her breaking point. The warning came on a Thursday afternoon during her free period, when she had taken refuge in the library to work on a chemistry lab report. The library at Roosevelt High School was her sanctuary, a place where the normal social rules seemed temporarily suspended in favor of academic pursuits. Mrs. Martinez, the head librarian, maintained strict policies about noise and behavior that created an environment where even Tyler and his friends were forced to moderate their actions. Kenna had claimed her usual table in the back corner, surrounded by chemistry textbooks and reference materials. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows, creating a warm pool of light that made the worn carpet seem almost inviting. She was absorbed in her work, carefully documenting the results of an experiment involving acid-base reactions, when the familiar sound of expensive shoes on library carpet alerted her to approaching danger. Tyler, Brady, and Ashley moved through the library like sharks cutting through still water, their presence creating ripples of tension that other students instinctively avoided. They approached Kenna's table with the casual confidence of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. "Well, well," Tyler said, his voice carefully modulated to avoid attracting the librarian's attention while still carrying clearly to nearby tables. "If it isn't our favorite little ghost." Kenna's hands stilled on her keyboard, every instinct screaming at her to flee. But the library represented one of her few safe spaces at Roosevelt, and she was reluctant to abandon even this temporary sanctuary. Instead, she focused on her lab report, hoping that her obvious engagement with academic work might discourage whatever confrontation they had planned. "We were just talking about you," Ashley added, sliding into the seat across from Kenna with the fluid grace of someone who had never been denied anything she wanted. Or wondering how someone so pathetic managed to trick Rodriguez into feeling sorry for them. The comment hit its intended target, flooding Kenna with a mixture of shame and protective fury. Liam's friendship was the one good thing in her life at Roosevelt High School, the single bright spot in an otherwise miserable experience. The idea that his kindness was based on pity rather than genuine affection was almost too painful to contemplate. "Please," Kenna whispered, her voice barely audible even in the library's enforced quiet. "I'm just trying to study." "Study?" Brady laughed, the sound harsh enough to draw a warning glance from Mrs. Martinez at the circulation desk. "What's the point? It's not like you're going anywhere with your life." The casual dismissal of her intelligence and ambitions stung more than Tyler's physical intimidation ever could. Kenna had always been an excellent student, earning recognition for her academic achievements despite her social struggles. Her carefully maintained grade point average represented hours of dedicated work, a tangible proof of her worth that couldn't be diminished by social rejection. "I have a 4.0 GPA, she said quietly, the words carrying more defiance than she had intended. "Oh, wow," Ashley said with exaggerated amazement. "The freak can memorize textbooks. How impressive." Tyler leaned forward, his blue eyes glittering with malicious interest. "But here's the thing about your little academic success story," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than if he had shouted. "It doesn't matter how smart you are if nobody respects you, and lately your boyfriend seems to be forgetting that lesson." The threat was implicit, but unmistakable. Kenna felt her blood turn to ice water as she understood what they were really saying. Liam had become a target because of his association with her. Her friendship with him, the one good thing in her life, was putting him in danger. "Leave him alone," she said, her voice gaining strength despite the terror flooding her system. "He hasn't done anything to you." "Hasn't he?" Brady's pale eyes held a coldness that made Kenna's skin crawl. "He's been interfering in things that don't concern him, making certain people think they're more important than they actually are." "Rodriguez needs to learn some boundaries," Tyler added, his casual tone making the threat even more ominous. "Sometimes accidents happen to people who stick their noses where they don't belong." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, poisoning the academic sanctuary Kenna had tried to create for herself. She could see the scenario playing out in her mind, Liam cornered in some isolated location, facing the same kind of systematic intimidation she had endured for months. But where she had chosen passive resistance, Liam might actually fight back, escalating the conflict in ways that could result in serious consequences for everyone involved. "What do you want?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "We want you to remember your place," Ashley said with false sweetness, "and to help your boyfriend remember his." They left as suddenly as they had arrived, their departure creating a wake of whispered conversations and curious glances from other library patrons. Kenna sat in the aftermath, her hands shaking as she tried to process the implications of what had just occurred. The lab report on her laptop screen blurred as tears threatened to spill over, weeks of accumulated stress and fear finally overwhelming her carefully maintained composure. For the first time since arriving at Roosevelt High School, Kenna seriously considered fighting back, not with words or complaints to authority figures who had already proven their unwillingness to address the systematic harassment she faced, but with the skills Sensei Williams had spent years teaching her. She could end Tyler's reign of terror in minutes, could reduce Brady's intimidation to pathetic posturing, could demonstrate to Ashley that social status provided no protection against someone who had been trained to defend themselves. The fantasy was compelling in its simplicity. She imagined Tyler's shocked expression when his casual grab met trained resistance, Brady's confusion when his physical intimidation was answered with superior technique, Ashley's disbelief when her social weapons proved useless against someone who had never wanted her approval in the first place. But even as the violent scenarios played out in her imagination, her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Violence should always be the last resort, Kenna. The mark of a true martial artist isn't their ability to hurt others, but their wisdom in choosing not to." Dr. Michael Blackwood had been 8 years old when his own father had died in a bar fight, leaving behind a widow and 3 children to struggle through poverty and social stigma. The experience had shaped his entire approach to conflict resolution, turning him into someone who believed passionately in the power of peaceful solutions, even in the face of overwhelming provocation. "Strength without compassion is just another form of bullying," he had told her during one of their training sessions in the converted barn behind their Montana ranch. The techniques I'm teaching you aren't weapons. They're tools for protecting yourself and others when all other options have been exhausted. The philosophy had seemed noble and achievable in the safe environment of their mountain home, where conflicts were rare and usually resolved through honest conversation between reasonable people. But Roosevelt High School operated according to different rules, where social status was maintained through the systematic humiliation of those deemed inferior, where authority figures chose willful blindness over difficult interventions. Still, Kenna couldn't bring herself to abandon the principles that had guided her entire life. If she used violence to solve her problems, what would that make her? How would she be any different from Tyler and his friends, who used their advantages to hurt people weaker than themselves? The answer came 3 days later, during what would prove to be the final confrontation in their long campaign of harassment. Kenna was eating lunch at her usual corner table, picking at a sandwich while reviewing notes for an upcoming calculus exam. Liam had been delayed by a meeting with his guidance counselor about college applications, leaving her to face the cafeteria's social dynamics alone for the first time in weeks. The solitude felt strange after becoming accustomed to his daily companionship, like stepping out of a warm house into winter cold. She was so absorbed in her review that she didn't notice Liam's arrival until he slid into the seat across from her with more force than usual. When she looked up, her heart immediately sank. His normally cheerful expression had been replaced by something she had never seen before, a mixture of pain and anger that transformed his familiar features into those of a stranger. "What happened?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Nothing," Liam said quickly, but the angry red mark on his left cheek told a different story. "Just ran into something." The lie was so transparent that it would have been insulting if it weren't clearly motivated by a desire to protect her from guilt rather than any attempt at actual deception. Kenna could see the careful way he held himself, the subtle favor he was showing his left side that suggested bruised ribs beneath his flannel shirt. "Liam," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "tell me what really happened." He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture that spoke of exhaustion and frustration. "Tyler and his friends cornered me after gym class. They said I needed to learn to mind my own business." The words hit Kenna like physical blows, confirming her worst fears about the consequences of their friendship. She had brought this on him through her mere existence, had made him a target simply by accepting his kindness. The guilt was overwhelming, a crushing weight that made it difficult to breathe. "They hit you," she said, the words coming out flat and emotionless, despite the storm of feelings raging inside her chest. "It was just a push," Liam said, but his eyes told a different story. "I'm fine, Kenna. Really." She could see the truth written in the tension around his eyes, the careful way he moved when he thought she wasn't looking. Tyler and his friends hadn't been content with verbal warnings. They had escalated to physical violence, crossing a line that transformed their harassment from psychological abuse into assault. "This is my fault," she whispered, the words barely audible above the cafeteria's background noise. "They're doing this because of me." "No," Liam said with surprising vehemence, reaching across the table to take her hand. "This is not your fault. Tyler's a bully who doesn't like being called out on his behavior." His touch was warm and reassuring, but Kenna could feel the slight tremor in his fingers that spoke of suppressed anger and pain. He was trying to protect her from the guilt and responsibility that rightfully belonged to her, demonstrating the same selfless kindness that had made him a target in the first place. Before she could respond, the cafeteria around them began to fall silent. Conversations died mid-sentence as students turned to stare at something behind Kenna's back, their expressions ranging from anticipation to horror. She felt, rather than saw, the approach of familiar footsteps, the measured pace of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. "Rodriguez!" Tyler's voice cut through the sudden quiet like a blade through silk. "We need to finish our conversation from earlier." Kenna turned to see Tyler, Brady, and Ashley approaching their table with the same casual confidence they had always shown, but something was different this time. Their usual cruel amusement had been replaced by something colder, more calculated. They moved like soldiers, advancing on a defeated enemy, secure in their victory but determined to ensure complete surrender. Liam started to stand, his face flushing with anger, but Kenna grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Don't," she whispered, her voice carrying a desperation that cut through his protective instincts. "Please." "Listen to your girlfriend," Ashley said with a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "She knows what's good for you." The cafeteria had become a theater, with every student turning to watch the unfolding drama. Phones appeared as if by magic, their cameras focused on what everyone expected to be another episode of the daily humiliation show. The circle of spectators pressed closer, hungry for entertainment that would provide social media content and hallway gossip for weeks to come. "Although," Tyler continued, his eyes glittering with malicious anticipation, "I think it's time we dealt with the real problem here." The words carried a finality that made Kenna's stomach clench with fear. She had endured months of harassment, had accepted her role as the school's designated target, but something in Tyler's tone suggested that the game was about to change in ways she couldn't predict or control. Before she could react, Brady moved with surprising speed, grabbing the back of her hoodie and yanking her to her feet with enough force to send her chair toppling backward. The crash echoed through the silent cafeteria like a gunshot, and Kenna found herself standing in the center of a circle of spectators who watched her humiliation with the fascination usually reserved for car accidents. "Get your hands off her!" Liam snarled, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. He started to move around the table, but Ashley stepped smoothly into his path. "I wouldn't," she said, her voice sweet as poisoned honey, "unless you want to end up in the hospital." Two more of Tyler's friends materialized from the crowd, Marcus Webb and Jake Sullivan, both members of the football team who had been waiting for their cue to join the performance. They flanked Liam with the casual efficiency of people who had done this before, their presence making it clear that any attempt at rescue would be met with overwhelming force. Tyler moved to stand directly in front of Kenna, so close that she could smell the expensive cologne he wore and see the gold flecks in his blue eyes. His face held the same expression a cat might wear while toying with a wounded mouse, a mixture of predatory satisfaction and casual cruelty. "You know what your problem is, Mouse," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent cafeteria. "You think you can hide behind other people, but sooner or later you have to face the truth about what you are." "I'm not hiding," Kenna said, her voice barely audible but somehow steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "No." Tyler's hands shot out to grab the front of her hoodie with both fists, his knuckles white with the force of his grip. "Then let's see what's underneath all this fabric." The sound of tearing filled the cafeteria as Tyler began to pull at her beloved hoodie, the worn cotton starting to give way under the pressure. Kenna heard Ashley's laughter mixing with Brady's jeers, saw the crowd of students watching with expressions that ranged from horror to fascination to cruel amusement. The hoodie had been her armor for months, her protection against the world's cruelty and judgment. It was her last tangible connection to the life she had lost, the grandfather she had loved, the sense of safety and belonging that had been stripped away when her family moved to Colorado. And now they were destroying it in front of an audience of hundreds, turning her most precious possession into entertainment for their twisted pleasure. "Stop," she said, but her voice was lost in the chaos of tearing fabric and excited whispers. "What's wrong, Mouse?" Brady jeered from behind Tyler's shoulder. "Not so tough now, are you?" The hoodie stretched and tore, seams splitting as Tyler continued his assault on what remained of her dignity. Kenna felt the fabric separating, felt the cool air conditioning against her skin as her protection was literally ripped away piece by piece. The humiliation was complete, absolute, witnessed by every student in the cafeteria and recorded by dozens of phones for posterity. "Stop it!" Liam's voice cracked like a whip, but when he tried to move forward, Marcus and Jake stepped closer, their message clear without words. The hoodie gave way completely, hanging in tatters around Kenna's shoulders like the remains of a flag after battle. The cafeteria erupted in a mixture of laughter, gasps, and the electronic beeping of phone cameras capturing every moment of her destruction. "There," Tyler said, stepping back to admire his handiwork with the satisfaction of an artist completing a masterpiece. "Now everyone can see what you really are." But as Kenna stood there in the wreckage of her armor, something fundamental shifted inside her chest. The fear that had controlled her for months began to transform into something else entirely. A cold, clean anger that had nothing to do with her martial arts training and everything to do with the basic human right to exist without being tormented. She looked up at Tyler, and for the first time since arriving at Roosevelt High School, he saw her clearly. Her green eyes held no tears, no defeat, no submission. Instead, they burned with a fire that made his triumphant smile falter and die. The girl who had cowered before him for months was gone, replaced by someone who stood straighter, moved with more purpose, carried herself like a person who had finally remembered what she was capable of becoming. "You're right," Kenna said, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. "It is time to see what I really am." With fluid movements that seemed almost casual to the untrained eye, Kenna shrugged off the remains of her grandfather's hoodie and let it fall to the cafeteria floor. Underneath, she wore a simple black tank top that revealed arms corded with lean muscle, shoulders that spoke of years of disciplined training, a core that had been strengthened by countless hours of practice. Her stance shifted subtly, her weight balanced on the balls of her feet in a way that transformed her from victim to something far more dangerous. The quiet girl who had accepted months of harassment was gone, replaced by someone who had spent 6 years learning to protect herself and others. "What?" Tyler started to say, but Kenna moved. 6 years of mixed martial arts training exploded into action with the sudden violence of a thunderclap. Every technique Sensei Williams had taught her, every form she had practiced, every principle of combat she had absorbed came together in a display of controlled fury that left the entire cafeteria stunned into silence. Tyler's surprised grab met empty air as Kenna ducked with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years learning to slip punches from larger, stronger opponents. Her counterattack was immediate and devastating. A perfectly timed elbow strike to his solar plexus that doubled him over with a whoosh of expelled air. The technique was textbook perfect, designed to disable without causing permanent injury. Brady recovered from his shock first, moving to grab Kenna from behind, but she was already spinning to face him. The leg sweep that followed was a thing of beauty. A classical Muay Thai technique that sent him crashing to the cafeteria floor with enough force to rattle the nearby tables. The cafeteria erupted in chaos, but Kenna moved through it like a dancer, performing a choreographed routine. Every motion was precise and controlled, every technique executed with the mechanical perfection that came from years of repetitive practice. Ashley lunged at her with her manicured nails extended like claws, but Kenna simply caught her wrist and applied a basic joint lock that sent the girl to her knees with a yelp of pain. The technique was designed to control rather than injure, demonstrating the restraint that had been beaten into her through countless hours of training. "Kenna!" Liam's voice cut through the noise, but she was already moving again, her attention focused on Tyler as he struggled to recover his breath and his composure. The quarterback had recovered enough to throw a wild punch, but Kenna slipped it easily and responded with a combination that would have made her sensei proud. A jab to disrupt his guard, a hook to his floating ribs that folded him sideways, and a beautiful uppercut that lifted him off his feet and sent him stumbling backward into a table full of surprised freshmen. Brady was trying to regain his feet, but Kenna was there first. She grabbed his collar with both hands and executed a perfect hip throw, a classical judo technique that sent him sliding across the polished cafeteria floor until he came to rest against the far wall. The entire sequence had taken less than 30 seconds, but it had transformed the social dynamics of Roosevelt High School forever. The girl they had dismissed as a helpless victim had revealed herself to be something far more dangerous, someone who had chosen mercy over violence until they had finally pushed her too far. Marcus and Jake, Tyler's reinforcements, hesitated at the edge of the conflict, their confidence evaporating as they watched their supposed alpha reduced to a groaning heap on the cafeteria floor. They were big and strong, but they were also smart enough to recognize the difference between trained skill and raw aggression. "This isn't possible," Ashley gasped from her position on the floor, cradling her twisted wrist against her chest. "You're just a mouse." Kenna turned to face her, and Ashley flinched away from the intensity in those green eyes. "No," Kenna said, her voice carrying absolute certainty. "I'm a fighter. I've always been a fighter." Tyler struggled to his feet, his face bloody and his swagger completely gone. Blood trickled from his nose, and his expensive Letterman jacket was torn and stained. For the first time since elementary school, he had been defeated in front of an audience, his carefully constructed image of invincibility shattered beyond repair. "You can't do this," he wheezed, his voice lacking its usual authority. "You're nothing." Kenna advanced on him with the smooth confidence of a predator who had finally revealed her true nature. Every student in the cafeteria pressed back, creating a wider circle around the confrontation as they realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. "I'm everything you're not," she replied, her voice steady and controlled despite the violence she had just unleashed. "I'm disciplined, I'm trained, and I'm tired of your bullying." Tyler swung again, this time with desperate fury rather than calculated cruelty. But Kenna read the telegraphed punch like text on a page. She stepped inside his guard, caught his wrist, and used his own momentum to send him spinning. A perfectly executed sweep took his legs out from under him, and he hit the floor hard enough to make the nearby tables shake. This time, he stayed down, his body language radiating defeat in ways that words never could. The cafeteria had descended into complete chaos. Students were shouting, chairs were overturned, and the sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway indicated that teachers were finally responding to the disturbance. But in the center of the storm, Kenna stood perfectly calm, her breathing barely elevated despite the exertion. She looked down at Tyler's prone form, and for a moment, the entire cafeteria held its breath. She could end this now, could make him pay for every humiliation, every cruel word, every moment of fear he had caused her and others. Her training had given her the tools to hurt him badly, to ensure that he never bothered anyone again. Instead, she knelt beside him, her voice low enough that only he could hear over the chaos surrounding them. "I could hurt you," she said quietly, her words carrying absolute conviction. "I could break bones, could put you in the hospital. But I won't, because I'm not like you." Tyler's eyes were wide with fear and confusion, all his arrogance stripped away to reveal the insecure bully underneath. "What are you?" "I'm someone who believes in second chances," Kenna said, rising to her feet. "Don't waste yours." She turned to address the crowd of students who had gathered around them, her voice carrying clearly across the chaotic cafeteria. The authority in her tone was undeniable, born from the confidence that came with knowing exactly what she was capable of. "I never wanted to fight anyone," she announced, her words causing the noise to die away into respectful silence. "I just wanted to be left alone. But if you threaten me or the people I care about, I will defend myself." Her eyes found Liam in the crowd, and she saw nothing but admiration and concern reflected in his dark gaze. He pushed through the other students to reach her, his hands gentle as he checked her for injuries she didn't have. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft with wonder and worry. "I'm fine," she replied. And for the first time since arriving at Roosevelt High School, she meant it completely. The crowd began to disperse as the sound of adult footsteps grew closer. Tyler and his friends were helped to their feet by reluctant classmates. Their reign of terror effectively ended by 30 seconds of controlled violence that had revealed the true balance of power. Mr. Peterson was the first teacher to arrive, followed closely by Principal Williams and the Vice Principal, Mrs. Davis. They took in the scene with the weary expressions of educators who had seen too many cafeteria confrontations, their eyes moving from the overturned furniture to the obviously shaken students to Kenna herself, who stood in the center of it all, looking remarkably composed. "What happened here?" Principal Williams demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. The question was met with the kind of selective silence that always followed school conflicts, students suddenly developing severe cases of memory loss when faced with potential consequences for their testimony. But this time was different. This time, multiple voices spoke up simultaneously. "Tyler was attacking the new girl," someone called out from the back of the crowd. "They tore up her clothes," added another voice. "She was just defending herself," declared a third student, and soon the air was filled with accounts that painted a surprisingly accurate picture of what had actually occurred. Principal Williams' eyes settled on Kenna, taking in her torn clothing and defensive posture. His expression was unreadable, but she could see the wheels turning as he processed the implications of what he was hearing. "Miss Blackwood," he said formally, "I'll need you to come with me to my office." "She didn't do anything wrong," Liam said quickly, stepping closer to Kenna in a gesture of solidarity that drew approving murmurs from several nearby students. "Mr. Rodriguez," Principal Williams replied, with the kind of patience that suggested this wasn't his first rodeo confrontation, "I appreciate your concern, but this is a matter that needs to be addressed through proper channels." As they walked toward the administrative offices, Kenna felt the weight of hundreds of stares following her progress, but for the first time since arriving at Roosevelt High School, those stares carried something other than mockery or derision. Students who had never acknowledged her existence before nodded respectfully as she passed, and she heard whispered comments that spoke of admiration rather than ridicule. The principal's office was exactly what she had expected. Institutional furniture, motivational posters, and the kind of artificial plants that were supposed to make the space feel welcoming, but only emphasized its bureaucratic nature. Principal Williams gestured for her to sit in one of the chairs facing his desk, while he settled into his own seat with the careful movements of someone managing chronic back pain. "Miss Blackwood," he began, his voice neutral but not unkind, "I've been teaching and administrating for over 20 years, and I've seen a lot of cafeteria fights. But what happened today was different." Kenna remained silent, unsure whether this was the beginning of a punishment or an acknowledgement of the circumstances that had led to her actions. "Multiple students have come forward to describe months of systematic harassment that you've endured from Mr. Garrison and his friends," Principal Williams continued. "They've also testified that today's incident began when Mr. Garrison physically assaulted you by attempting to remove your clothing. The formal language made the humiliation sound clinical, but it didn't diminish the reality of what she had experienced." Kenna found herself wondering why these same students had never spoken up before, why it had taken a public display of her fighting abilities to motivate them to tell the truth. "I also understand the principal said, consulting notes he had made during his interviews with witnesses, "that you have extensive martial arts training." "Yes, sir," Kenna replied quietly. It was her first admission to anyone at Roosevelt about the years of training that had shaped her approach to conflict resolution. "Why didn't you use those skills before today?" The question was asked without judgment, but Kenna could hear the genuine curiosity behind it. Principal Williams had been dealing with school violence for decades, but he had rarely encountered a situation where the victim possessed the ability to end their torment, but chose not to use it. "My father taught me that violence should always be the last resort," she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "I hoped that if I ignored them, they would eventually get bored and leave me alone. But they didn't. No, sir. And when they threatened my friend, when they tried to humiliate me like that..." She trailed off, realizing that she didn't have adequate words to explain the transformation that had occurred inside her. Principal Williams nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Blackwood, I want you to understand that I cannot officially condone violence as a solution to interpersonal conflicts. The district has strict policies about fighting on school property." Kenna's heart sank as she prepared for the suspension or expulsion that would complete her social destruction. "However," Principal Williams continued, "the circumstances of today's incident are extraordinary. Multiple witnesses have confirmed that you acted in self-defense after months of documented harassment. Mr. Garrison and his friends will be facing serious disciplinary action, including possible suspension and removal from extracurricular activities." The relief that flooded through Kenna was so intense that she felt momentarily dizzy. She had expected punishment, expulsion, the complete destruction of her academic future. Instead, she was being treated like a human being whose rights and dignity mattered. "There will be consequences," the principal warned. "You'll need to meet with the school counselor to discuss conflict resolution strategies, and there will be a formal mediation session with all parties involved once Mr. Garrison has recovered from his injuries." "Injuries?" Kenna asked, suddenly worried that she had hurt him more seriously than intended. "Bruised ribs, possible concussion, wounded pride," Principal Williams said, with what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Nothing permanent, but enough to ensure that he takes this incident seriously." As Kenna walked back toward the cafeteria to collect her belongings, she was amazed by the transformation in the hallways around her. Students who had previously ignored her or whispered cruel comments behind her back now stepped aside respectfully, offering smiles and nods of acknowledgement. It was as if her public display of strength had fundamentally altered her position in the school's social ecosystem. "Kenna!" Liam's voice called out from behind her, and she turned to see him jogging down the hallway with her backpack slung over his shoulder. His face was bright with concern and something that looked like pride. "How did it go?" he asked, falling into step beside her. "Better than I expected," she admitted. "Tyler and his friends are in serious trouble, and I'm not getting expelled." "Good," Liam said with satisfaction. "It's about time someone held them accountable for their behavior." They walked together toward their next classes, but Kenna found herself struggling to process the magnitude of what had changed. For months, she had been defined by her victimhood, reduced to nothing more than Tyler's favorite target. Now, in the space of 30 seconds, she had reclaimed her identity and demonstrated that she was capable of protecting herself and others. "I can't believe you never told me about your training," Liam said, shaking his head in amazement. "You're basically a superhero." "I'm not a superhero," Kenna corrected, but she was smiling as she said it. "I'm just someone who finally remembered that she doesn't have to accept being treated badly." The rest of the school day passed in a blur of whispered conversations and curious stares, but the quality of attention she received had fundamentally changed. Where once she had been the subject of cruel gossip and mockery, now she was treated with a respect that bordered on awe. Students who had never spoken to her before made efforts to engage her in conversation, and teachers who had previously overlooked her began calling on her more frequently in class. But the most significant change was in Kenna herself. She walked taller, spoke more clearly, and no longer felt the compulsive need to hide behind oversized clothing. The hoodie that had been destroyed in the cafeteria had been more than just fabric. It had been a symbol of her decision to make herself invisible rather than risk confrontation. Without it, she was forced to face the world as she truly was, rather than as she feared others might see her. A week after the cafeteria incident, Tyler approached her at her locker during the morning break between classes. His face still showed faint bruising from their encounter, and he moved carefully in a way that suggested his ribs were still tender. But his expression had changed in ways that went beyond physical discomfort. The arrogant confidence had been replaced by something that might have been humility. "I wanted to apologize," he said quietly, standing at a respectful distance that acknowledged the new dynamics between them. "What I did was wrong. What we did was wrong." Kenna closed her locker and turned to face him, studying his face for any sign of deception or manipulation. Finding none, she nodded slowly. "Apology accepted." "I don't understand," Tyler said, his confusion genuine. "Why didn't you fight back before? You could have stopped us any time." It was a question she had been asking herself repeatedly over the past week, trying to understand her own motivations and choices. The answer, when it came to her, was both simple and complex. "Because I was hoping I wouldn't have to," she replied honestly. "Violence should always be the last resort. But when you threatened Liam, when you tried to humiliate me like that, you left me no choice." Tyler nodded slowly, beginning to understand the principles that had guided her behavior. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Really sorry. And I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." "Everyone deserves a second chance," Kenna said, echoing her father's words. "Don't waste yours." As Tyler walked away, Kenna reflected on the strange turns her life had taken since that morning when her grandfather's hoodie had been torn from her shoulders. The destruction of her armor had forced her to confront the person she really was, beneath all the protective layers she had constructed. Liam appeared at her side, as if summoned by her thoughts, sliding into the space Tyler had vacated with the easy grace that characterized all his movements. His presence still caused a flutter of warmth in her chest, but it was no longer tinged with the desperate gratitude of someone who had never expected kindness. "How are you feeling?" he asked, a question that had become their standard greeting since the cafeteria incident. "Different," Kenna said, after considering the question seriously. "Stronger, I guess, like I finally found something I didn't even know I was looking for." "Which was?" "Myself," she replied simply. "The real version, not the one I was trying to be." They walked together toward their respective classes, but their path took them past the cafeteria where everything had changed. Through the open doors, Kenna could see students eating lunch and socializing in the same space where she had been publicly humiliated and had chosen to fight back. The memory no longer carried the sting of shame. Instead, it felt like a moment of transformation that had been necessary for her to become who she was meant to be. "I have a confession," Liam said as they paused outside his chemistry classroom. "What's that?" "I've had a crush on you since the day you started here," he admitted, his cheeks flushing slightly with embarrassment. "Even when you were hiding behind that hoodie, even when you seemed determined to be invisible." Kenna felt her heart skip several beats as his words sank in. "Really?" "Really," he confirmed with a smile that made her forget how to breathe properly. "You were always beautiful, Kenna. You just needed to see it yourself." She reached out to take his hand, marveling at how natural the gesture felt, despite her months of social isolation. I'm glad you were patient with me while I figured things out. I would have waited as long as it took, Liam said seriously. Some things are worth fighting for. As the bell rang and they reluctantly separated to attend their respective classes, Kenna caught sight of her reflection in a classroom window. The girl looking back at her was confident and strong, unafraid to meet the world's gaze directly. She no longer needed external armor to protect her from life's difficulties. She had found her strength in the knowledge that she was capable of defending herself and the people she cared about. The hallways that had once felt like a battlefield now felt like home. Students smiled and greeted her as she passed. Teachers engaged her in meaningful discussions about her academic interests, and she discovered that Roosevelt High School contained far more good people than she had initially realized. They had always been there. She simply hadn't been in a position to see them while she was focused on avoiding the few who had made her life miserable. During lunch period, their usual corner table had been transformed from a place of isolation into a gathering point for students who appreciated authentic conversation over social posturing. Marcus Chen, a quiet boy from her calculus class, had started joining them to discuss mathematics and philosophy. Sarah Martinez, a girl from her English class who wrote poetry in her spare time, brought her notebook and shared verses about finding strength in unexpected places. Even some of Tyler's former followers had begun gravitating toward their group, drawn by the genuine acceptance they found there. "I can't believe how much everything has changed," Sarah said one afternoon as they discussed the themes in the novel they were reading for English class. "It's like the whole school is different now." "The school was always the same," Kenna replied thoughtfully. "I think I'm the one who changed." It was true in ways that went beyond her decision to fight back against her tormentors. The experience of standing up for herself had unlocked something fundamental in her personality, a confidence and assertiveness that had always been present but had been buried under layers of self-doubt and conflict avoidance. She began participating more actively in class discussions, sharing insights and opinions that demonstrated the intelligence she had previously kept hidden. Her teachers responded positively to this new engagement, and several encouraged her to consider advanced placement courses and academic competitions that would challenge her intellectually. Mrs. Patterson, her chemistry teacher, approached her after class one afternoon with an opportunity that would have been unimaginable months earlier. "Kenna," she said, organizing papers on her desk with the methodical precision that characterized all her actions, "I'm wondering if you might be interested in joining our academic decathlon team. We compete against other schools in science, mathematics, and literature, and I think your analytical skills would be a valuable addition to our group." The invitation was both thrilling and terrifying. Academic decathlon required public speaking and performance under pressure, exactly the kinds of activities she had spent years avoiding, but the girl who had once hidden behind oversized hoodies was gone, replaced by someone who understood that growth required accepting challenges rather than avoiding them. "I'd like that," she said, surprised by her own decisiveness. "When do we start?" Her involvement with the academic decathlon team provided yet another avenue for positive social interaction. The students who participated in academic competitions were there because they genuinely enjoyed learning and intellectual challenge rather than social status or popularity. They welcomed her contributions without reservation, treating her as a valuable team member rather than a curiosity or social experiment. Coach Harrison, the faculty sponsor for the team, was a mathematics teacher in his 40s who had competed in academic decathlon during his own high school years. He approached coaching with the same strategic mindset that successful martial arts instructors used, analyzing each team member's strengths and weaknesses, then developing training programs designed to maximize their potential. "You have excellent recall and analytical abilities," he told Kenna after her first practice session. but you need to work on projecting confidence during the oral presentation portions of competition. The judges aren't just evaluating your knowledge, they're assessing your ability to communicate complex ideas clearly and persuasively. The feedback was exactly what she needed to hear. Her years of martial arts training had taught her physical confidence, but intellectual confidence required different skills that needed to be developed through practice and experience. She began working with Liam and other team members to practice public speaking, gradually becoming more comfortable with expressing her ideas in front of groups. The transformation wasn't limited to her academic life. Her relationship with her parents had also improved dramatically as they watched their daughter emerge from the shell of isolation that had worried them since the move to Colorado. Dr. Blackwood was particularly pleased to see her applying the principles he had taught her about conflict resolution, and he expressed pride in her ability to show mercy even after demonstrating her capacity for effective self-defense. "I was worried that the move had broken something essential in you," he admitted during one of their evening conversations on the back patio of their suburban home. "But I think it actually revealed strength that was always there." Her mother, Sarah, had been documenting the transformation through photographs that captured the gradual changes in Kenna's posture, expression, and overall demeanor. The progression was remarkable, from the hunched, defensive girl who had started at Roosevelt High School to the confident young woman who now walked its hallways with purpose and dignity. "You look like yourself again," Sarah said while reviewing the photos on her laptop. "Like the daughter I remember from Montana, before everything became so difficult." The comparison was apt. Kenna had spent so much energy trying to become invisible that she had lost touch with the person she had been before moving to Colorado. The quiet confidence, the intellectual curiosity, the natural leadership abilities, all of these qualities had been present in Montana, but had been suppressed by her response to the hostile environment at Roosevelt. As winter progressed toward spring, Kenna found herself genuinely looking forward to each school day rather than dreading the renewed cycle of harassment and humiliation. The academic decathlon team was preparing for regional competitions. Her grades had improved even beyond her already high standards, and her friendship with Liam had evolved into something deeper and more meaningful than she had ever experienced before. Their relationship had developed gradually, built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection that made it feel both natural and inevitable. Unlike the dramatic romantic relationships she observed among her classmates, theirs was characterized by comfortable silences, intellectual conversations, and the kind of emotional intimacy that came from truly understanding another person. "I've been thinking about prom," Liam said one afternoon as they studied together in the library. The annual dance was still months away, but Roosevelt High School began promoting these events early to ensure maximum participation and revenue. "Oh?" Kenna looked up from her calculus homework, surprised by the sudden change in topic. "I know it's not exactly your scene," he continued, his voice betraying a nervousness she rarely heard from him. "But I was wondering if you might want to go with me." The invitation was both thrilling and terrifying. Prom represented everything she had avoided since arriving at Roosevelt: social gatherings, formal dress codes, public displays of romantic affection. But it also represented an opportunity to participate fully in the high school experience she had been denied by months of social isolation. "I'd love to," she said, the words coming out before she had fully processed the decision, "but I have no idea how to do any of that stuff: dresses, makeup, dancing." "We'll figure it out together," Liam replied with the kind of confidence that made her believe anything was possible. "Besides, you don't need to change anything about yourself. You're already perfect." The comment made her blush in a way that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with the kind of happiness she had almost forgotten was possible. For months, she had been focused on survival. on simply enduring each day without being completely destroyed by the cruelty of others. The idea that she might actually enjoy her time at Roosevelt High School had seemed impossible until very recently. As spring arrived and brought with it the promise of graduation and new beginnings, Kenna reflected on the journey that had brought her from terrified victim to confident young woman. The transformation had been painful and difficult, requiring her to confront aspects of herself that she had preferred to keep hidden. But she had also discovered that strength came in many forms: the physical strength to defend herself when necessary, the moral strength to show mercy rather than seek revenge, and the emotional strength to remain open to friendship and love even after experiencing cruelty and rejection. The girl who had hidden behind her grandfather's hoodie was gone, but she had been replaced by someone better, someone who understood that true power came not from the ability to hurt others, but from the wisdom to know when not to use that ability. Someone who had learned that the most important battles were often fought inside oneself, and that victory looked like finding the courage to be authentic in a world that often rewarded conformity and cruelty. Standing in the hallway at Roosevelt High School, surrounded by friends who valued her for who she truly was, rather than who they thought she should become, Kenna Blackwood finally understood what her father had been trying to teach her all along. Strength without compassion was just another form of bullying, but compassion without strength was merely powerlessness disguised as virtue. The balance between these qualities, the warrior and the peacemaker, the fighter and the healer, had defined her journey from victim to victor. And as she looked toward a future that seemed suddenly full of possibilities rather than obstacles, she knew that the lessons she had learned would serve her well in whatever challenges lay ahead. The mouse was gone, replaced by someone who understood that the greatest victory wasn't defeating your enemies, but helping them become better than they were. And in that transformation, both she and Roosevelt High School had found something worth fighting for: the belief that everyone deserved the chance to be their best self, even if they had to fight for it.